Perdona, pero hoy yo hablar inglés. Es un vergüenza, pero es así. The first part of my talk is going to be a read presentation because there are some things that are quite specific that I want to make sure I get right. Normally I don't read presentations and I don't like reading presentations, but I have to confess that talking in the Prado I feel a bit more nervous than I normally do. And on that note, I'd just like to thank very much all the people here at the Prado who I've worked with and who've been so kind to me over the last 8 years that I've been working here in Madrid. So today, what I want to do is to present or raise or ask a few questions or present a few thoughts about the future of museums. Museums, I like the word, or museum, I like the word very much, because a museum literally is the home of the muse. And really, the muse is something I'm going to talk about quite a lot in the first little part of the presentation. We need to collectively ensure that the museums of the future provide the right environment for the muse to thrive and to allow the things that she watches over to live and to communicate the complex, layered thoughts they mediate. Their messages are more relevant today than ever as the age of branding and superficial celebrity begins to decline. So my first thought is a small thought about museums generally and about two words that are used a lot to describe museum things. The first word is object and the second is artifact. Usually when people talk about things in museums, they talk about objects or artifacts. But I want to start this talk by looking at both of those words, because the object, or an object, in a museum is really a subject. It's really something with its own history, its own biography, and its story reveals both how it's been seen over time and why it has been, or is, or sometimes isn't, considered of importance. For too long, objects have been presented as matters of fact, but this is unfair to them. They're much more interesting than that. It's taken a great deal of work over many centuries to turn subjects into objects. The second word, artifact, is a beautiful word because it has the evidence of making embedded in it. Interestingly, the Greek root of the word art is synonymous with that for technique. It's techne. So to the Greeks, there was no difference between art and technique. An artifact, the factum part of artifact, is placing the emphasis firmly onto the act of making. Interestingly, the workshop that I work in here in Madrid is called Factum Arte. It's taken artifact and it's inverted it. Really, the emphasis there is purely on making. In science and technology, artifact has two meanings. It's both the object of reference, so artifact in a museum sense, but it's also a process error or anomaly. It's something you don't want. I love this double play on the word because every artifact in a museum contains artifacts in the scientific sense. Artifacts that come through the process of aging. Artifacts that come through acts of conservation to try and preserve the work. But all of these artifacts that the artifacts in the museum have condition the way they look. They add layers of meaning onto the object. And it's those layers of meaning that we need to unravel to really turn the objects in the museum back into rich subjects that we can all feed off and engage with. I'm going to try and do the next bit quite quickly because I've got a lot I want to get onto in the practical side. But I said it took many centuries to turn objects to turn subjects into objects. This work has been done in museums. There's much discourse about the first museum, but in England, and I'm sorry my references tend to be English when it comes to museums, but in England it's widely accepted that the first use of the word museum was in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. The Ashmolean collection was based around a group of objects that Elias Ashmole acquired through very dubious means. In fact, it was very close to theft, from the family of John Tredescant. John Tredescant opened Tredescant's Ark in London, which was based on Lambeth Bridge in a purpose-built building. And as its name implies, it was full of living things, the Ark in Noah's sense. Not literally living, but they were mainly naturalia rather than human artifacts. There were fossilized things, dried things, stuffed things, including the last dodo that was stuffed, but very sadly, once it was in the Ashmolean, it decomposed. And now all that's left of the last dodo is its beak and its foot. In 1682, when Elias Ashmole's donation was finally opened as the Ashmolean Museum, something very interesting happened. The term museum does not apply to a private collection. It only applies to public collections. And this is one of the very important fundaments of what a museum is. Public ownership, the advancement of knowledge, a systematic and recognizable scheme of classification, and public access. Reasonable public access. Sometimes by special permission, sometimes for a fee. But public access is critical. The preferred environment in a museum is a quiet place containing objects that stimulate our thoughts. They are there to be shared, to be seen, to be discussed, and to be collectively agreed upon, but not as permanent, unchanging truths fixed inside their glass cases. This is why I like the word thing. A thing, and I'm aware in Spanish, so I hope the translation can do this, thing doesn't have the meaning in Spanish it has in English. In English, a thing is actually a matter of concern that is collectively agreed upon. The word actually derives from the first parliament in Iceland, the Althing, where the local community would gather together to discuss divisive matters of concern and establish a general sense of consensus. Our hold on objects and things is very provisional, full of unexpected surprises. Some of those surprises only become apparent in retrospect, and this is one element that makes objects as important as they are. We often can't really see or understand why they're important, except looking backwards, except reflecting on them. And museums themselves are unfixed. This is, again, a point that I think very often gets overlooked. I remember first coming to the Prado in 1980. I was deeply moved. I think it was then and still is probably my favorite museum. But I was able to spend hours undisturbed in an environment that seemed neglected, but was absolutely full of love and care. I was able to look quietly at Velázquez's paintings, completely undisturbed, for days. The same with Goya. And at that time, as a young romantic English painter, I was particularly attracted to Goya's Colossus. And interestingly, a few months ago, or even weeks, I can't remember how long the show's been on, I was in the Prado and saw Manuel Amena's very interesting small display reattributing Goya's Colossus to a follower. The reasons for the reattribution were all the reasons I liked it as a young painter. Its awkwardness, its complex surface, the overpainting. And I think it's fascinating that even with an artist like Goya, whose provenance is relatively uncomplicated, there's still a potential for reinvention and reattribution. I remember coming back to the Prado again in about 2000. The space was more or less as it appeared in my memory, but it was infused with a freshness and a light. Many of the paintings seem much cleaner than I remember them. I'm not sure if it was on this visit, because I sort of like the way memory plays little tricks and collides everything together, but I remember looking at Sebastiano del Piombo's Pieta. It was a painting that I'd had a great privilege to know intimately in Casa Pilatos in Sevilla before it came here to the Prado. It's an oil painting over slate, and the natural aging of the oil had created a strange white bloom over the surface. When I was looking at it in the Prado, it had become coherent and fresh and very beautiful. While I was looking at the painting, a thought came to mind, and really this is the foundation of Factum and what I'm going to talk to you about today. I like to think it was the muse whispering in the quiet Prado. But a thought came to mind. Actually, in restoration, when we rework the surface of an original, removing paint, adding paint, treating it with extraordinary love and attention, are we in fact turning the original partially into a reproduction of itself? Would it actually be possible to separate out these acts, to place the emphasis on documentation and recording and surface, to really become aware, layer upon layer upon layer, of what was intrinsically important in that object? That thought stayed with me for rather a long time. And effectively, what I'm going to show you today, I'm going to raise a lot of questions, many more than I answer, because the truth is I don't have answers for them. But I'm going to look at 4 projects that are going on right now that mix technology and art, and perhaps offer some innovative solutions to the way that museums can work to engage their audience and to let the muse fly and breathe life back into the complex narratives that the objects hold. I'm not going to talk about everything Factum does, because that wouldn't be possible in 1 hour, not even to start. But the 4 projects touch on different issues that concern originality. Originality is one of my pet subjects, and everyone in Factum knows that I get very boring on the subject. But basically, to me, originality is not about some mythical aura that's emanating from a work, some quasi-religious sense of presence. Originality is a process. It's something that develops with time, that can be given, can be taken away. And if we think of all these objects as active subjects, then it's easy to understand the implications that can emerge of when you start thinking about originality as being a process. So the first project I'm going to look at raises very complicated issues about originality and the very emotional question of repatriation. The project was the production of an exact facsimile of Veronese's Wedding at Cana and its installation into Palladio's refectory on the island of San Giorgio Maggiore as part of the restoration of that great building. The second project is about preservation and an attempt to redirect the public's growing awareness of green issues into the preservation of our cultural heritage. The proposition is simple. Can tourists become a proactive and powerful lobby, contributing to the preservation of the past and ensuring that collectively we hand on something meaningful to future generations, that we hand on something that's in at least as good condition that previous generations handed it on to us. And the project is exceedingly timely and very important. It's one we're working on in the Valley of the Kings with the Supreme Council of Antiquity, where the vast number of tourists are rapidly leading to the destruction of the tombs in the valley. The third project ties into the foundations of museums and museum philosophy. It's the creation of a research center devoted to the work of Miguel Ángel Murici in the town of Caravaggio, the town by which he's normally known. So Michelangelo Merisi actually was not from Caravaggio. This is another aside. He was from Milan. But nearly everybody knows him as Caravaggio. And finally, I want to raise a question about how technology can lead to a re-evaluation of our cultural history through carefully curated exhibitions. And the exhibition I'm going to talk about a little bit is an exhibition we're working on now for the Fondazione Giorgio Cini called A Contamination of Taste, the Arts of Giovanni Battista Piranesi, which will open the Venice Biennale of Architecture in August. An aside before I start, one of the things that happens in Factum is we work staggeringly fast. So this exhibition was conceived in October of last year, and when you come to see what we're doing, I'm very nervous right now because we have to deliver all the objects and all the things we're working on next month, and half of them still don't exist. So, Veronese. The Wedding at Cana is the largest painting in the Louvre. It's approximately 10 meters by 7 meters, and it was painted to decorate the end wall of the refectory in on the island of San Giorgio Maggiore, designed by Palladio. Its importance really lies in the fact that there was a great deal of rivalry between Palladio and Veronese. Palladio, the great architect at the height of his career, at a time when architecture was the supreme art form, was being challenged by the underdogs who were claiming that the arts of painting and music were actually more important and more supreme. For many in Italian art history, really the painting of The Wedding at Cana is the point at which painting won the battle. That the masterpiece that Veronese created, which is perhaps the most complex narrative painting in the Louvre, it's a painting which contains most of the Counter-Reformation arguments and which links together musical harmonies and color harmonies in a way that perhaps only a Venetian could. The fame of the painting was such that when Napoleon's troops freed Venice from the Australians, they decided they'd take the painting as payment for freeing the state, the Republic of Venice. To remove a painting of this size from a wall is quite a difficult act. So Napoleon's soldiers took swords and they cut it 6 times horizontally and ripped it off the wall. It was then rolled up, taken to Paris, where it underwent, as you can imagine by this time, quite an extensive restoration. My estimate, looking at the painting and studying it at the amount of time we've spent with it, is that probably about 30% of the paint was lost in its removal from the wall. The result, it was then put on show in the Louvre. It was the most famous picture in the Louvre until about the beginning of the 20th century, when a small little picture, which had loosely been attributed to Leonardo, suddenly becomes firmly attributed to Leonardo and represented exactly what everyone was looking for at the beginning of the 20th century. So now the Veronese hangs in front of the Mona Lisa, and it's really impossible to look at it because 6 million people a year troop in to look at the Leonardo, and you have this enormous painting behind you with the 2 queues coming beside it, and really you need to stand in front of this painting and look at it for hours to start to unravel its meaning. When I got a phone call saying, "Come to Venice, we've got a job for you," I remember walking into this refectory, which was partially conserved at the time, and seeing this vast wall and thinking, why couldn't they have a smaller painting? Because this is going to be a nightmare. The reason they'd asked us is that during the restoration of the refectory, they'd attempted an installation, they'd attempted a projection of the painting onto the end wall. But as soon as that was done, everyone realized, A, the projection didn't look like the painting, it didn't have the materiality or physicality of the painting, but also when you could see the painting, you couldn't see the refectory, and when you could see the refectory, you couldn't see the painting, and therefore really the dialogue between these two things was not possible. So after 8 months of negotiation, we were given permission to go and record the painting in the Louvre. And then after 8 months of work, which is actually incidentally about as long as it took Veronese and his team to paint it, we installed the facsimile into the refectory. I apologize for this picture, but I use it a lot because it's quite interesting. The color in our facsimile and the color in this picture look very different. The reason for that is that the uniform zenithal light in the Louvre makes it very, very difficult to take accurate color pictures. When the Louvre finally gave us permission to record, and this is where the technology part comes in, I'm not going to get boring or nerdy on technology today, but when the Louvre finally gave us permission, it was on 4 or 5 conditions, and I think they thought we would just say it was impossible. So the first condition was we worked without scaffolding. The second condition was that we removed all our equipment every morning. The third condition was that we only worked at night. The fourth condition was that we weren't allowed any external light sources. The only lights we could have had to be integral to the recording system. And the fifth condition was that we had to pay 2 night guards to be with us all the time. And I remember going to the meeting when we first discussed this and coming out with one of my colleagues who helped a lot. And I said, okay. And as we left, Bruno said, Adam, how are you going to do it? And I said, like everything, I really don't have a clue. We're going to sit down in Factum, we're going to talk amongst ourselves, and we're going to come up with a solution. The solution was a telescopic mast designed to be mounted on the top of tanks. We had a problem because the company at the time was rather overworked because of the Iraq War, but we managed to buy a precise telescopic mast and mount onto it a flatbed scanner that sort of resembles the kind of flatbed scanner you might have at home, where you put your piece of paper on top and scan, only we'd redesigned the flatbed scanner so it worked 10 centimeters away from the surface of the painting. All of this was tested. The scanner has its integral light sources built into it, and we built this recording system in a matter of weeks because we had very, very little time before we went in. As you can see in the first photograph, we also carried out some white light scanning of the relief of the surface, because obviously without scaffolding we were only able to do the 3D recording at the bottom part of the painting. The next problem, working in the almost dark with only lights attached to the scanning system, was to do color matching. And Factum actually has developed over many years an optical system of color matching where Naoko Fukumaru, our conservator, makes color sticks with exactly the right sheen and tone and color that are compared close to the surface, so we can have exact color references for each color that we need to put into the facsimile. And one of the favorite objects, this is a tiny detail we have, is we had a one-to-one plan of the bottom half of the painting covered with tiny color sticks like this that are stuck onto it, so we have an exact reference. In the color matching, we keep printing, cross-referring, printing, cross-referring. And the printing side, which is done by Rafa Rafczewski, who's here, is exceedingly complicated, very technical, very physical, and dependent on a printer that was built in Factum Arte, specifically for the work of a Russian photographer called Boris Savelyev, who had very, very dark images and very complicated images, but wanted a lot of information in the shadows. This printer is able to overprint in perfect register onto surfaces like gesso-coated canvas until we've got exactly the right color and tone. The sheen comes later. We have to print on a painting that's 10 meters by 7 meters, we have to print in sections. The sections are then assembled. In this case, we had to make the painting in Madrid and take it to take it to Venice and install it on the wall. But from this point on, basically the work that goes on in Factum is pretty much straight conservation. It's filling cracks, it's filling tears, it's rebuilding the image back so that here you have a direct comparison. On the left side is the white line is one of our joins, and the right image is the retouch join. The horizontal line is not one of our faults. The horizontal line is one of Napoleon's cuts that was restored in the Louvre. The painting has been through many restoration histories, and I don't really want to get hung up on those, but the surface of the painting is extraordinarily complicated. It was then taken to the San Giorgio Maggiore, and the final joins were all stitched there, filled, the varnishing was done, the painting was lifted into position. And the ultimate retouching was done when it was vertical on the wall. When the painting was unveiled, in 2007, I have to admit I was incredibly nervous, because nobody wants Venice or anywhere else to be filled with bad copies. The public response to the facsimile has been completely and utterly extraordinary, with many of Italy's leading art historians claiming that a copy of this veracity in its original position is actually more original than the heavily restored original in the Louvre. That's not a claim I would ever make or even go along with, but it is interesting that the authenticity of the experience when you're in the refectory with the painting is a very extraordinary thing. The second project. I don't think there'll be any more calls for this painting to be repatriated. And actually, I could go on, but I'm just getting my first time signal. So the issue of repatriation is one I think the museums have to deal with. And in many ways, this kind of solution was really quite an inspired solution, because you couldn't take the painting from the Louvre and put it in the refectory, even if you wanted to, without altering the conditions in the refectory that make the refectory what it is. So it has extraordinarily beautiful daylight coming in from both sides. It has no door. So you go up and into the building. It's an inviting refectory. It's used for public events, for dinners, for concerts, for conferences. And in order to put a painting of that importance into a building of that importance, you would have to make significant changes to the building. So the building would have to be sacrificed for the painting, or the painting for the building. So in some ways, the introduction of a facsimile, which can be there and allow the experience to be had, and for me the most beautiful moment was realizing that the painting actually has a time. So while we were installing it, at about 6:30 in late August, the sun coming in the right-hand windows falls on the left-hand side of the painting, illuminating the bride and groom, theoretically the subject of the painting, but in the Louvre they're pushed right into one corner. And the shadows on the wall of the painting completely harmonize with the shadows on the wall of the building. And I think this sense of being able to see that is something that's completely impossible in the Louvre, where the painting is hanging at the wrong height in a frame between two doors with a uniform light. So I think the painting's history has been served very well by its 200 years in Paris, where the Impressionists and the Romantics like Géricault and Delacroix were able to suddenly find the freedom of paint that was able to lead them away to the tight academic disciplines of the time. And probably, had it stayed in Venice, it would no longer exist, because the refectory was turned into a military barracks. The floor was removed. A woodworking studio was put in the bottom half. Another floor was put across the middle. The top half was turned into a theatre, and the floor went right through the middle of where the painting would have been. So I think revisionist histories are always dangerous, but there's something very beautiful to stand in the refectory now and think the original's in Paris and you can see it, and a facsimile that's very, very close to the original is there in Venice and you can see it in its original location. If I'd said when we were doing that project, that 1 year later, 1.5 years later, 15,000 people would pay 12 euros each to stand for over an hour looking at a facsimile. Everyone would have laughed. But that was exactly what happened when Peter Greenaway produced one of his spectacular multimedia projections onto the surface of the painting, turning the painting into a narrative of itself. The second project, which is really one close to my heart and one I'm going to have to keep it short on because I can talk for hours on this one, was a project that began 8 years ago. And it began at the request of the Supreme Council of Antiquities to ask if it was possible to produce an exact facsimile of the tomb of Seti I, which they'd had to close to the public because of conservation reasons. And they asked if it was possible to produce an exact facsimile that when you entered into, you couldn't see the difference between the original and the facsimile at all. That led really to the work that many of the team in Factum are involved with all the time, which is high-resolution 3D scanning. The tombs are covered in high relief. They're in exceedingly poor condition. They're visited by large numbers of tourists, and they're at critical risk. Seti I was closed in 85 after the ceiling collapsed as a result of the humidity variations in the tomb. Seti is a much more complicated tomb than that, and in fact most of its damage had occurred in the 19th century when Belzoni decided to make the first facsimile by casting the walls of the tomb with wax. He did make the first facsimile, which was opened in London in 1821 and really triggered the whole Egyptomania as it became known. But in so doing, he removed about 50% of the paint in the tomb. He wasn't alone. The Italians and the French went in and cut out sections. So there are now over 140 fragments of the tomb of Seti I scattered around museums around the world. When I say fragments, the fragment in the Louvre is 3 meters by 1.5, and the fragment in the Museum of Archaeology in Florence, which is identical, is also 3 meters by 1.5. They're big fragments. But the tombs are suffering, and this image is one that I show quite a lot. On the left was a photograph, it's not actually this yellow, the color is right in the right-hand image. On the left is a photograph taken in 1978 in the tomb of Thutmose III, and on the right is a photograph taken in 2000. The damage that's occurred on the surface is caused entirely by the popularity of that tomb and the importance of this depiction of Thutmose III suckling from the breast of Isis in the form of a tree. And the tour guides come in with their groups and tap the image to show where it is. In order to stop this, most of the tomb is now covered in glass. But in Egypt, where it's incredibly dusty and incredibly hot, the glass gets humid, the dust sticks to it, and now most of the tomb it's very difficult to see. In fact, this tomb it's very difficult to see anyway. Although it's still open to the public, it's high up on the side of the valley, it's about 50 degrees, so it's incredibly hot when you go in. It's very humid because there's no ventilation, you sweat profusely, and most people can stay in there for about 5 to 10 minutes. The other problem with the conservation in the valley, and this is an image from the tomb of Seti I. In my opinion, I think this is probably the most important wall painting in the Valley of the Kings. It's really a family portrait. So Horus is on the right, who is the sort of brother of the pharaoh. Seti is the second figure from the right, who's greeting Osiris, his deified father, and Isis, his deified mother. The section in the middle was a section of restoration, well, really consolidation, carried out in 1990 by the American Research Center in Cairo. The condition of the paint on the surface of the tombs is exceedingly fragile. One of the other tombs we're working on is the Tomb of Nefertari, and Nefertari was conserved in the late 80s by the Getty Conservation Institute and has subsequently been closed to the public again because the fragility of the paint simply can't take the humidity. You can still see Nefertari if you're a politician or if you're exceedingly rich, but it's closed to the general public. In the tomb of Seti, and one of the things that, I mean, we do a lot in Factum is work with the different conservation bodies, but the Getty Conservation Institute has now identified that one of the biggest problems that faces the Valley of the Kings is the many layers of consolidation that have gone on in an attempt to arrest some of the problems of the paint falling off. I mean, it's all of these conservation issues are incredibly complicated. This is, if you look at the left-hand side of the square, you can see a white triangle. This is a photograph taken in 2001. The area on the left of the white line in the middle is unconserved. The area on the right of the white line has been conserved, but the consolidant has already started to yellow and to crack. This is a photograph of the same area taken in 2008. And now the problem is serious. It was consolidated with a paraloid. The paraloid is absorbed into the surface of the paint and can't be removed. And as you can see from this raking light photo, the white paint in the restored area is now lifting off. The tomb we were asked to go and work in was the tomb of, well, actually we were asked to go and work in the tomb of Seti, but there was too much work going on there with excavations, so we ended up working in the tomb of Tutankhamun. Tutankhamun is visited by over 1,000 people a day. In the morning, it's relatively dry and not too hot. By the end of the day, it's exceedingly damp and very, very hot. It's these temperature fluctuations that put the walls and the paintings under extraordinary pressure. So we were asked to develop a cold light photographic system. This is an image of Grégoire Dupont recording the photographic data. We did white light and laser scanning. All of the white light scanning was done by Pedro Miro, who was in the tomb working for 8 hours a day, recording every part of it. And effectively, we built a three-dimensional map and a color map of all the walls and the sarcophagus in the tomb. What do I mean by a three-dimensional color map, or a color map with three-dimensional data? This is an example of a color photograph, 1:1 at 800 dpi. So the whole of the tomb was recorded in tiny fragments and then stitched together. This is an example of the surface of the same area. It's actually a rendering, so this is one of the images that are generated by our laser scanners. You can just see the texture. In fact, if you look carefully, you can see the headgear, the beard, the details. In the laser scanners we're using record 100 million independently measured points per square meter. It's the highest resolution, most detailed recording. We don't just do that for some kind of macho reason. We do that because basically the data we're recording is essential for monitoring the condition of the tomb. So what to many scanning systems are considered as noise, as artifacts, the texture, the surface, are normally smoothed out in most scanning systems where you're merging video data with a point cloud that's optimized. In fact, we're interested in all of the things, all of the cracks, all of the things that make that surface specific. I'm going to skip this because I know I'm running late. We then turn that three-dimensional data back into the real world. So this is now that three-dimensional data you were looking at before, routed or cut or milled, there's a whole lot of words, we tend to use routing for this work, into a sheet of polyurethane. So now we have all of the relief data back in Madrid on the surface of a block, and then we mix it with the color data that has to be mapped on top in perfect register. So this is a little section really outlining the theory of what's done. We then apply that to the whole tomb. But technology, most people think of technology as somehow being impersonal. Technology doesn't do anything. People do. And this is Pedro, who did the scanning, who's been working, putting all of the archives of 3D data together. This is Blanca Nieto, who's been redistorting and correcting and balancing all the color. Gregoire Dupont, who's not here in a photograph, has been working on making three-dimensional models, has been working on making high-resolution browsers that will allow the digital archive to become a central resource for the documentation center at the Supreme Council of Antiquities. So one of the things that always alarms me when I'm working in Egypt particularly, but actually everywhere, is how easy it is to gather all the data together in one place so it can be studied easily. But how difficult, because of copyright, because of commercial interests, this actually is to do. What we're trying to do now with the Supreme Council, and because they own the copyright on all the data in the tombs, we think there's a possibility to do it, is to come up with a browser. So in this case, you have a little yellow speech balloon, but I would like this image to be covered in little speech balloons, any one of which you can click on, and can either give you information about problems, about restorations that have been carried out, about photographs before or after, that can really give you an in-depth understanding that both allows you to monitor the condition of the tomb, but also for academic purposes allows really in-depth study. I'll come to that in a second, so I'm going to go fast now. Rafa then has the dauntless, never-ending task of printing and matching the color. We go on printing till we think it's right. I then go back to Egypt and we compare the printed samples directly to the wall. If you look carefully here, it's got little windows. We then, with Juan Carlos's team in the Nave, cut all of the whole tomb in 3 dimensions. This is Anya working on filling all the cracks in the cut area. I like this photograph because this is a photograph in Factum studio on just about any day. To the left, we have a corner of the Tomb of Tutankhamun. In the background to the right, we have the 3D print of Seneca and Nero that we made for the Prado and the city of Cordoba. And behind Seneca and Nero, we have one of the giant Assyrian lions that is part of a project we're doing with the British Museum to record all the fragments that were removed from the throne room of Ashurnasirpal in the 19th century and have subsequently been dispersed around museums in Europe and America. But by recording all of the fragments, we can create a facsimile of all the known bits of the eastern end of the throne room and give it to the museum in Baghdad, where it will be able to be seen alongside the fragments they have remaining. They don't have very much. Then Sylvia and her team start making all the molds. We assemble all the walls. We transfer the color. I say we. Factum works both as a team. Factum's about 30, 35 people now, and really that's its strength. No one person can do everything now. In fact, they never could. There was only a brief period of time when the artistic genius moved into the image of depraved, soul-ridden, soul-searching artists. Even Van Gogh needed his brother. So basically, we work as a team. Everyone has special skills. It's completely horizontal, apart from the fact that I'm a kind of dictator who shouts a lot. But apart from that, it's completely horizontal. And we work with other people who can do things that we can't do. So in this case, we were having trouble getting the high-resolution data onto the surface of Tutankhamun because it has too much relief. Our printer couldn't handle it. So we're now working with a wonderful small company in Barcelona called Papahel. Papahel, run by Julio, developed an elastic transfer material so that we can transfer the printed data with perfect color over our surface in perfect register. It's very beautiful and it works perfectly. So right now, our studio doesn't look like the previous shot. It looks like this. As the north wall has come back, the east wall is now back, and we're assembling the whole tomb. Here it's still not finished. There's an area to go below, the floor, the sarcophagus, the ceiling. We need to create the exact environment. So when people in Egypt walk into this tomb, they suspend belief. They're not being tricked. Everybody knows they're going to be visiting a facsimile. But when you walk in, you suspend belief enough to really engage and study in depth. And one of the beauties about facsimiles is you can see them in ways that it's not possible to view the original. So this was our facsimile, or this is our facsimile of the tomb of Thutmose III, which, and again, facsimiles, when you say facsimiles, everyone thinks, oh God, I'd much rather see the original. What's happened with the facsimile of Thutmose III, and to some degree with the Veronese, is the reverse. So my probably greatest moment of pride since we started Factum was when Eric Hornung, probably the greatest Egyptologist at the moment, now very elderly, spent 3 days in this facsimile making a film about the text in the facsimile. Actually, the reason the tombs are important is because of their texts. So the tombs are really the object that carries the important subject. The tomb in Thutmose III is the Amduat. It's the first text in humankind that describes in poetic, philosophical, and artistic terms what happens when we die. So it's the foundation of many religions. Eric, after spending 3 days making a short documentary about the Amduat, said that he'd learned more in 3 days in the facsimile about the text than he had in 50 years in Egypt. And that's, as I mentioned before, because when you're in the tomb of Thutmose III, A, you can't see it properly because it's behind dusty glass, but B, you can only spend about 5 to 10 minutes in there without extreme discomfort because of the temperature and the smell and the heat. I'll say something very quickly about this. The other use of facsimiles, and interestingly, because I was talking about Tutankhamun, I put this in. At the moment, up in Casa del Campo, there's an exhibition of Tutankhamun based not on facsimiles, but on copies. Copies effectively made to be sold to hotels and tourists in Egypt. But there's something very, very interesting about what they've done in that exhibition, and I went expecting to hate it, and I came out actually really quite liking it. That you're able to show this kind of wonder that Howard Carter and Lord Carnarvon must have felt as they opened that little hole and saw this clutter of objects. This is something you can never do with original objects. You could only do that with copies of this kind. And I think the show is unapologetically didactic and really quite interesting. So Project 3, and I'm going to go fast because I want to get to Project 4, is a research centre in the town of Caravaggio. There's an awful lot I want to say about this, but I'm going to try and keep it really brief. With the facsimile of the Veronese, the facsimile was important to put on the end wall to make sense of the restoration. With the work we're doing for the research centre in Caravaggio, the facsimiles are only evidence of the quality of the data we record. So they're there as a physical way of viewing the data. Really, the emphasis is on all the other ways of viewing the data. For this work, Greg and Piers and Naoko worked on making the recording system. It's a track-based system. We record in the church. We recorded 3 Caravaggios in the church of San Luigi dei Francesi in Rome. And again, we recorded at night. Again, we removed all our equipment. And we recorded at the same resolution that we'd recorded the Caravaggio, the Veronese. So you can really start looking and studying the surface details of these paintings. When I was young, the great privilege was going to museums and they were empty, so you could sit looking for hours at paintings. My great privilege now is that most of the recording we do is staggeringly boring and monotonous. But that gives you plenty of time to sit at night and look at the complexity and the details of the, where's my mouse? Here we go. Of the Caravaggio paintings, and to start asking a large number of questions about, let's see if I can get this to work, about the paintings themselves. This is what we're doing with the data. I want this data to be available in the research centre where you can see it on high-resolution screens, but I want you to be able to do this at home. This is a browser put together by Grégoire Dupont. You can zoom in up to 5 times magnification over the entire surface of the painting. And what we're working on now is bringing together the archives for the Institute of Restoration in Rome that are X-ray archives, bringing together the infrared spectrometry, so you can build what we refer to as a layered archive, an archive that will allow you, in a quiet situation, either at home. Sadly, I don't think you'll be able to do this at this speed with this ease and freeness over the internet, but you can definitely do it if you go to the research centre and look carefully through the data that will be assembled there. The research centre is opening now. It's opening. I'm going there straight after this talk. So the paintings are on their way, and it opens very soon. So this is an example of a layered data. Here you have a high-resolution color. You can zoom in on this, like the one I've just shown you. An X-ray photograph that's scaled to fit behind this one. So you just click on another layer, and you can see the X-ray. You can click on another layer and you can see the infrared. You click on another layer and you can see the 3D. You click on another layer and you can see its conservation history. You can go on clicking on layer after layer after layer as long as we can assemble the data. But one of the things we do, and I'm going to show you this video, I wasn't. One of the things we love doing in Factum, because most of us are artists, is we love trying to work out how and why things were actually done. So everybody talks about Caravaggio using...
Move a bit your head and you will see that the whole thing doesn't matter. So you can slightly move.
I can move, for example, from here, I'm absolutely fine. If I move to here, I'm getting a different reflection on the glass, but it's not affecting the image at all.
That's because the reflection of my head is floating exactly on top of the canvas.
Yes.
So we don't, this work and Factum really was started by myself and Manuel Franquelo. Manolo still works very, very closely with us, and he's inspired engineer, and he's also fascinated by optical systems. So this is simply saying Caravaggio didn't use a camera obscura, it's much too complicated. He was running around. We know the picture of the martyrdom of Santa Lucia, which is in Syracuse, was painted in 6 weeks from commission to completion. He was only in Syracuse for 8. He was on the move. He didn't use a camera obscura. He didn't use a camera lucida either, because that's very small and you'd have to scale up.
We shouldn't be drawing with line. So we want to be drawing entirely tonally. See, the fault here is that I don't want to be putting a line around the edge of things. That's Andy Warhol. I want to be effectively drawing in tonal blocks where I'm not thinking about what I'm drawing.
That little video is just the start of really quite an in-depth research that we're carrying out into the techniques of Caravaggio. And we're talking to a lot of the academics, so people like Roberto Lapucci, who are convinced that he was using luminous paint. Did luminous paint exist in the beginning of the 17th century? Yes, it did. They were grinding up fireflies' tails and using it as luminous paint for theatrical experiences. We know Caravaggio had access to Galileo through his patron. We know he was fascinated by theatre. So basically, we want the research centre to act as a dynamic focus where one by one, all of the Caravaggio paintings will be recorded and added. We've done 3. The next 2 are scheduled to start. The project will probably last 20 years. So a big part of the work now is training on, delegating, making people aware of really what's possible if you let the muse speak, if you give her time, and if you really treat these things as subjects to be studied, not objects to be revered. So the last thing is an exhibition. And the exhibition is about Piranesi. Like most things in Factum, and again, this is difficult because being English, Piranesi represents 18th century and stately homes and all the things I didn't like as a slightly troubled radical child. And so I ignored him. But in fact, I've become completely obsessed over the last 6 months, because I think Piranesi would have been the person in the world who would most love what we're doing in Factum. So we're taking, that was one of Piranesi's prisons, the previous image. We're taking those images to start the exhibition, and we're turning them into 3D models. So the first room in the exhibition, you will actually be confronted by, is that doing it? Sorry, is it? Yes, it is. You're confronted by a large screen in an installation, and gradually you'll move into the first prison, into the title page. This is a work in progress, so I shouldn't really show you this, but I like it so much at the moment. And you walk into the prison. You actually experience it. Piranesi did these prints, the Cartry, when he was 25 years old, when he basically was lost. He wanted to be an architect. He was getting fascinated by antiquity, by Roman scale. He was getting caught up in the Greco-Roman debate, where Winckelmann and the German decadents were presenting Greek purity as the dominant art form and trying to marginalize the engineering skills of the Romans. And Piranesi was arguing that the world was much more complex than that. He was as interested in Etrusca and Egypt as he was in Greece. And he built this strange world of connoisseurship and knowledge that really both interpreted the Renaissance, but also reinterpreted antiquity. So they were forming the image we have now of both antiquity and the Renaissance in the 18th century. And to me, this has been a great opportunity to really delve back into Piranesi's mindset and to try and understand what he was doing, what he was concerned with. And I want this animation, when it's finished, to have some feeling of The Shining. I don't know if any of you have seen the film, but where the camera moves down the corridor, so you become the camera. So I want this feeling that you're inside Piranesi's head, that you're going into these prisons that are really prisons of his imagination. And because we're in Spain, they are referred to as capricios. And one of the interesting things is that it's almost certain that in the Duke of Alba's collection, Goya had the chance to view Piranesi's capricios and English satire, and mixing those two together came up with the unique capricios that he did, this mixture of word and image. I'm going to move through this a little faster, otherwise I won't get to the bit I want, so I'm going to skip that video. What we're doing for the Piranesi show, the show will consist of 250 prints, the walkthrough, but also very few of Piranesi's actual designs were ever made as objects. The answer is 4 of them were made directly as objects. So we've been taking Piranesi's designs, both drawings after the antique and designs done in the 18th century by Piranesi, obviously inspired by the antique, but not after. And we're turning them using 3D modeling technologies. So I have Eduardo Luis and Miguel Angel, who are working non-stop at the moment to model these forms, to understand the complexity of the form, to then print it in 3 dimensions using various types of 3D printing. 3D printing is a whole other subject I can bore for hours on. Then use traditional techniques, casting it in wax, casting it in bronze, assembling the bronze and patinating it. And again, as I said, I like the fact that Factum draws in people who get excited by what we're doing, and without Elena Arias, who works here in the conservation department at the Prado, I couldn't have done this, because Elena basically taught me how to do silver patinas. And we've managed to patinate this tripod, give it an alabaster top, and produce an object entirely digitally, which then gets mediated by physical processes in bronze, which talks directly not only to Piranesi's print, but also to the tripod that it refers to, that claims that it is claimed was found in the Temple of Isis in Pompeii. I want to finish talking a little bit about how we can apply these different things into a museum environment, into a wider environment, so we can all work together to use technology both to understand and interpret art, but also to preserve heritage, both within museums and the heritage that's not an object but is out there in the field, like the tombs in the Valley of the Kings. So a 1.5 years ago, I set up with a few other people the Foundation for Digital Technology and Conservation. And the last point I really want to make is about the application of technology in conservation. The first thing is you mustn't be frightened of it. And that can only happen if you have a team of diverse experts, diverse engineers, artists, lateral thinkers, practical people, printers, photographers, software writers, 3D programmers, all sorts of things. So I like this photograph because it's the first printer we built in Factum, completely. And it looks completely chaotic, but using this, we printed onto vellum the high resolution, well, the near perfect facsimiles we made for the Biblioteca Nacional after documenting the Beato Primero. That scanner went through one or two stages and ended up as that printer went through one or two stages and ended up as the printer that I showed you earlier that we now use daily in Factum and is really one of Factum's great secrets, the sort of non-human workforce. Without this printer, we couldn't do what we do now. This is the book recording system that was again developed by Factum with a man called Ian Christie Miller, who'd been working on this for 15 years when I found him. It's a very simple system, actually originally devised in the 19th century to record rare manuscripts when they're only open at 60 degrees. So when you're trying to record a manuscript, if you open it like that, you very often cause more damage than you do good. This one records books when they're only open at 60 degrees, with some of the highest resolution images possible. On digital output, there's so many things that are possible now. And this is a printer that prints sculptures in cement that we built for the English artist Anish Kapoor and is now being scaled up eventually so it can print a building. But at the moment, it's printing sculptures for Anish. We also play around visualizing sound. But the reason I set up the Foundation for Digital Technology in Conservation was we want to find ways for museums and for heritage organizations to be able to incorporate technologies that are normally considered prohibitively expensive into their scheme of work and support them and offer them both software solutions and hardware solutions that do it. So over the last year and a half, the Foundation for Digital Technology has worked to develop this 2-camera, 1 laser scanner with Nikon metrology. In fact, we started off working with 3D Scanners UK, and they got bought out by Metris in Belgium, and Metris in Belgium got bought out by Nikon metrology. So one of the things you see instantly, that the technology market is very commercial. It's very much about branding. It's very much about keeping people outside of the box. I like showing you the first printer because the box is open. You can see everything. But this scanner we've developed with them specifically to our specifications. It's cost about 80,000 euros to develop so far, and it still doesn't work. It's got very, very good qualities. It will work, but it's always going to be an expensive scanner. With a small company in Barcelona, who I like very much, who work with white light scanning, they responded to our brief by adapting one of their scanners to be able to record at 50 microns. And they're now working with us to make the white light scanner work with cold light, because most white light scanners project light, but that means they give off a lot of heat. If you think of your video projector, they give off a lot of heat, and you can't take those into the tombs. So we're now working with them to fix it onto linear guides and to make it operate with cold light. But really the focus of the foundation is to try to establish some standards. So this is the standard scanning test that we developed. On the left-hand side of it, it's got some relief from the tomb of Seti I. In the middle, it's got some heavily cracked surface, and on the right, it's got some textured surface with image over the top of it. The black circle is because the two things that are hardest to 3D scan are black and gloss. So there's a black circle, a glossy circle, an overlapping circle, two grey circles, a satin circle, and a matte circle. And what we're effectively trying to do is to get all of the companies working in 3D scanning to use their equipment to scan the standard scanning test. So there can be objective, comparative examples that museums can refer to if they're thinking about acquiring a 3D scanner. The second problem with acquiring 3D scanners is they tend to cost between 50,000 and 100,000 euros. You tend to have to spend about 50,000 euros on software, and you tend to have to upgrade that software every year. So while some museums are able to buy or to get capital grants to buy equipment, very few are able to sustain and maintain that equipment if the market is constantly changing or demanding that the software is upgraded. So we're also working on software. And at the foundation at the moment, Manuel Frankello has actually just done something extraordinary, and the lateral jump where the muse was definitely smiling. We sat down and said, 3D software is very expensive. Can we handle 3D data in Photoshop? Most museums and most places now have access to Photoshop. So Manuel has just created the first software that allows you to handle accurate, high-resolution data, three-dimensional data in Photoshop. I'm not going to go in now to exactly how we've done it, but that led, I mean, this is the proof of the scanning test is not what the data looks like on the screen. The proof of the scanning data is what the data looks like when it's back in the physical world. You can do lots of things on screen that make data look good that's really not very good data. But what we decided after looking at the software and deciding to handle the data in Photoshop, I love saying that because normally when I go to 3D scanning conferences and I stand there and I just say we handle our data in Photoshop, everybody laughs. And there's that 3D world. These worlds are so discrete. And really the beauty of Factum is we have enough people who cross disciplines. And it's in that cross-disciplinary work that we're really able to progress in a way that can help the museums get the tools they want. So Manuel and I decided we should build our own laser scanner. So I said, okay, Manuel, we've got a budget of 3,000 euros to prove that it works. As most things, they start with conversations in bars. They develop beyond a conversation in a bar into a design drawing and a first idea. They then develop in Manuel's workshop in practice. And this image, I think, sums up Factum as well as anything. And if you could read the thing, it says laser pointer. That's a laser pointer that goes through a prism. Down at the bottom, it says 30 euro webcam, moving bed on friction Teflon bearings. That's the thing in the middle. Stepper motor salvaged from an old hard drive. The glass rods, which are our linear guides because they're friction-free. And that's your scanner. This scanner, in its first test, that's, as you can see, a one laser, one camera scanner, was able to record a leaf. It's only doing small things at the moment. And we were able to mill the leaf with no post-processing at all at a resolution of 100 microns. There's only 2 other scanners in the world that can do that we've come across so far. So what's next? What's next is to say, okay, let's keep pushing the lateral thoughts. Now we need a 2-camera, 1 laser system, and we need it to respond exactly to what we're doing in Egypt. So if we could supply the Supreme Council of Antiquities in Egypt with 5 laser scanners and train a team of operators in Egypt and make them exceedingly lightweight, so this scanner now weighs, Pedro, what is it, about 150 grams? Less. Very lightweight. It goes on very lightweight linear guides that can be carried by 1 person. It can scan an area of about 1 meter by 60 centimeters going up. And its really clever thing is it uses 2 video cameras. And in the 2, it just records video. We do the processing of the data into 3D at 100 microns back in the workshop. So it means the time spent in the tomb can be lessened. We can record 5 times faster with 10 times greater depth of field. And our aim and ambition is to be able to provide this system with all the software they need to museums, to the conservation departments, so they can be used during restoration projects. They can record the surface of all the paintings in the collection. The Supreme Council of Antiquities can have these, and we can supply these for less than 25,000 euros as a package that's closed, and you never have to pay any more money, and you can work in Photoshop. And I think it's this kind of engagement, both with technology and in understanding what the museums need and want, that makes the work that are going on in Factum Studios at the moment so deeply rewarding and exciting. And I feel incredibly privileged to be here and with a team of extraordinary people. It's very stressful sometimes. We have to work on very short deadlines. But we've done all of this with no significant investment and no public money. And I think in the future of how museums work and develop, it's this kind of lateral thinking that's needed to really protect and communicate the importance of the objects that are both here in the Prado and to turn them back into subjects. Thank you.